listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
Welcome back, horror hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast. Today we're going to be discussing two documentaries.
Completely opposite ends of the spectrum as far as documentaries go. Of course, they're both about horror, but one of them is about the movie-making process itself, a very in-depth, behind-the-scenes look at one certain movie. And then the other one is a deep exploration into hundreds of movies, documentary about folk horror. First, we're going to start out with Full Tilt Boogie. It's from 1997. It's about the making From Dusk Till Dawn. It's directed by Sarah Kelly, who was a production assistant on Killing Zoe with Eric Stoltz, and also Sleep With Me, one of my favorite movies, and Pulp Fiction. And I thought it was funny that that while we were watching this, you looked at me and you said, some of these people talking, like the way they carry themselves, this is just like Sleep With Me, like a 90s talkie. And then come to find out, the director is one of the production assistants on Sleep With Me. I thought that was a weird coincidence.
Yeah, there are times when it plays out like a 90s, those typical 90s movies like Sleep. Well, I don't want to say typical, but the kind they don't make anymore, like Sleep With Me or Clerks, or what's the other one? The one by Noah Baumbach.
Oh, yeah, Kicking and Screaming.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of that. The characters even behave in a way that reminds me of 90s movie characters. So I guess it wasn't just the movies, it was the attitude of the 90s. But
yeah,
it feels... I actually think this would make a good double feature with Sleep With Me.
Yeah, it would. Because all these people have big personalities, you know, even the crew members, the producers, everybody had this big personality, and everybody loved to show their personalities back then in the 90s.
Yeah.
But it's a documentary about the independent, non-union production of From Dusk Till Dawn and the people who made it. And I always love the way it opens up. It opens up with this quirky little segment filmed just for the documentary with Tarantino and Clooney kind of walking through the set and doing like a kind of a parody of themselves, kind of walking through, and then fans try to stop and get their autographs and stuff, and they kind of push them to the side, and then the 18-year-old girl comes up and they pay attention to her and everything.
It's all very
cool.
It's all pretty crude, but it's all obviously pretty much a joke, even the way that they're acting. There's even what lets you know it's a joke is just Tarantino's behavior. He's not the best actor in the world, so when he's acting like that way, there's something goofy about it. And I gotta say, it's pretty funny watching Tarantino with I don't know how you would describe his walk, that loping gait that he has.
Yeah.
Very pantherish, the kind of very self-confident, I'm super cool walking through this. Is very I don't know how to put it, but there's a self-awareness to it.
It shows the camaraderie on the set that they took this production assistant who was making her own documentary based on that, and they kind of stopped what they were doing in these big 17, 18-hour days to film little segments for her documentary. I thought that was kind of cool. But it features interviews with Tarantino, Clooney, other stars of the movie like Juliette Lewis, a small interview with Harvey Keitel, Michael Parks. I love the Michael Parks interview. The Fred Williamson interview. They interview Fred Williamson in full makeup when he's in the big, huge demon mouth. They also talked to effects artist Greg Nicotero, who was a blonde Adonis back then. He was so young. Executive producer Lawrence Bender. He was pretty cool. They even talked to the assistants of Clooney and Tarantino, production designers, grips, even the transportation department, the assistant directors, craft services. They really get an inside look at an independent production, especially a production as big as this, and it's only non-union just because Tarantino and Rodriguez got pretty popular on an indie level where they didn't have to go to the unions.
Well, another thing about that too is that Robert Rodriguez is an unusual filmmaker where a big reason for unions, especially in films, is for all the different jobs to make sure that everybody's taken care of. But when you have somebody he also edits the movie, he scores the movie, he shoots the movie, He does literally everything on it, so it kind of cuts out a lot of the need for other crew members that you would normally have on set when you have somebody like Robert Rodriguez directing.
Yeah, so then your non-union sets are getting bigger and bigger, and the union didn't know how to handle this. But I love how this movie explores so much stuff, because not only do you get to watch several iconic scenes being shot, you witness the conflict that arises, when the union starts targeting the production just because they're popular, not because anybody complained, not because they had a genuine problem with this production, just because they wanted to make an example out of them and frighten them into using union workers.
Yeah, it's a very interesting part of the documentary.
And also an interesting part of it was the cast and crew partying. I thought that was an interesting behind the scenes look, because everybody kind of loses their filter. They've been through 17, 18-hour days. They're just kind of trying to relax next to the pool. And probably one of my favorite scenes of the whole thing is Tarantino comes up. Everybody's partying by the pool. It's really late at night at a hotel. And Tarantino comes up and says, hey, they were telling us to keep it down. And I explained to them that we're exhausted. We just had a 17, 18-hour day. We just want to relax. And so we're compromised. They told us to keep the music down. So this guy's sitting around with a guitar and everything. So Tarantino has this whole spiel. And then he finishes his spiel, and then the guy with the guitar says, oh, what about doing an encore? Just one more song. Next thing you know, it cuts to a scene of Tarantino sitting with the guitar player just singing his heart out to Merle Haggard, Mama Tried.
I think that's one of the things that separates this from most behind-the-scenes documentaries, which most behind-the-scenes documentaries really go into the filmmaking process and everybody's job on set, which this definitely does do. But this goes into the personal lives of a lot of the crew and the cast members in the way that most of these don't. It also goes into the romantic and the sexual relationships that are going on set during the film. So this covers the things that go way outside what you see on film or what contributes to the actual filmmaking, and goes really deep into the interpersonal relationships that these characters have. I mean, there are moments when they're sitting around all talking about who they're crushing on and who likes who. They're gossiping about some of the people, some of the sex lives of other people on the set.
Yeah.
And I swear, it reminded me so much of something like Clerks or Sleep With Me. And it doesn't even seem like there's a camera there. I mean, I have to wonder if some of it, obviously you're going to behave a little bit differently with the knowledge that there's a camera somewhere, but there's a quality about this that feels like you're watching an independent film as opposed to a documentary about independent filmmaking. And I think the casual conversations and the way that the filmmakers allow you to get to know a lot of the crew members on a personal level that goes beyond the scope of what they're making as a film adds a personal touch that you don't see in a lot of documentaries like this. It doesn't feel just like, not that behind the scenes documentaries are sterile, but they're usually there to serve one specific purpose. This one seems like it's actually trying to be a piece of entertainment. Not only that, interviewing people in a more casual way gives it the feeling of watching a movie as opposed to a documentary. Sometimes you can forget that you're watching a documentary while you're seeing it.
Yeah, and you feel a camaraderie on set, like the sense of family, like a family unit. And they're so comfortable with the person making the documentary that they just kind of open up and they just be themselves. And
my God, really quick, another reason that this would make a good double feature with Sleep With Me is Tarantino is in Sleep With Me.
Yeah.
The character in that. That's the one where he goes on his Top Gun monologue about how Top Gun is a metaphor for being gay, for coming out as gay, which is really hilarious. I don't think that's remotely true at all. But Tarantino in here is just as much of a character as he is in that movie. There's a sense of self-awareness of he knows who he is when he comes on screen, the jokes that he makes, the stories that he tells. He's actually a pretty funny guy.
Yeah, he is. And this one part of this documentary I wanted to touch on real quick. I won't go too deep into it, but it just reminded me of how much times have changed. Because tell me if you agree with me. It seems like there was a lot of testosterone on set, but it was non-toxic testosterone, because a lot of the women were also in your face, kind of big personalities. So then, like, things like it shows that opening scene where it shows Clooney and Tarantino walking through the set, and Clooney kind of kids around and pushes autograph seeker down and calls him the F word
Hmm.
for a gay person. And that was more acceptable back then. It was a, you know, it wasn't meant to be derogatory at all. You can kind of tell, but times have changed, you know. And then they get real flirty.
I don't think they would be able to get away with that type of joke in a movie now. I don't think it's meant to be derogatory. And obviously, it's not a real autograph seeker. It's obviously set up as a choreographed thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a certain sense of testosterone on it that might turn a lot of audience. And I understand. I actually read some reviews of this on Letterboxd, and I think a lot of people took offense to some of the content in here.
Yeah, and how they kind of stop for the 18-year-old girl, and they're very touchy with her and stuff like that. And then Tarantino comes up. The assistants are in the middle of talking, and then Tarantino just comes up and announces, I could fuck any girl on the set if I wanted to. If I wanted to, I could fuck any girl. And at first you're like, holy shit. But what he's talking about in context, he was referring to what Bruce Willis said on the set of Pulp Fiction. So
he also said it a little less aggressive than how you just said it right now. It came across a little bit more goofy. Where I got to say, look, there's some stuff and some of the humor is not going to sit well with people, but it's the type of humor that was a little, I guess you would say, more normalized in the 90s, especially in the mid-90s. Kind of takes me back to another time. It kind of reminded me of how different things were. But when he says that at the end, he's smirking the entire time. He says, I could fuck anybody in set. And he says, but I'm not going to. I'm a good guy. I'm not like that. And then he walks off with that lopsided gait that he has, when he walks, you could tell that he knows that he just came in and injected a movie scene into what he was doing. He looks very aware. Like, it seemed like he probably calculated that moment. I'm going to slide in while they're talking right now. I'm going to make my crude, inappropriate joke, play it off lightly, and then just lightly walk off and go away. So there's a lot of stuff like that. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's a trigger warning, but just be aware that this came out in a different time when humor was a little bit different than it is now.
Yeah, and it ended up being a somewhat innocent story that was about someone else who was probably a little more problematic than Tarantino is.
Yeah.
If you're saying that to the director. And they also had the thing like the best set butt contest, where they had a Polaroid of everybody's butts on the set, and they voted which one was the best butt. That's another thing that wouldn't happen today. So I briefly just wanted to say, it might be a little controversial, but what I think is these are the kind of times that sometimes some of us may miss, and it's times that are gone and we can't have fun like that anymore. But it's worth losing stuff like this if we lost the real bad toxicity in our society. You know what I mean? Even if some of it's still there, we're more aware of it now.
I agree with you. There's a certain sense of fun that I don't think you would be allowed to have today, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing, because it's the type of testosterone and humor that a truly toxic person in real life on a film set could probably take advantage of what's going on set and kind of sneak in some really creepy shit or do something really wrong. I could see somebody on set using it to their advantage and playing it off like they're just messing around. So, but it's also interesting. It's a documentary. It really documents a certain time, and it captures a moment in time. And it's a little bit of a reminder of how different things were.
Yeah, and losing this type of fun on sets is kind of a casualty of things evolving and getting better.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
But there are ways to have fun on set, though.
Yeah, but it has some really good conversations with the different actors, and especially Tarantino and Rodriguez, how they discuss the story and how they wanted the audience to be surprised by the horror, just like the characters are. That's one of the main things I always loved about the movie. It's half of it's like a hip gangster film, and then all of a sudden the vampires are just thrown into the mix without warning. I love how they talk with the AD, the assistant director, about the creative process. It's a really good point. He said, how much does the creative process mean to you? He said, nothing. He said, I don't care about the creative process. He said, I do what the director tells me to do. If it's bad, it's bad. I'm just here to do my job. So that's a interesting perspective there. I love the story that Quentin tells about the two kegs, how he's mad at the grip department because the last party they had, one of the grip guys said, "Oh, don't get 3 kegs. 2 kegs should be fine." And then when they finished the second keg, like, Tarantino was pissed that the beer was already gone. And because of the grip department, we're out of beer.
Yeah.
Such a fun, loose
Atmosphere.
type of atmosphere. Yeah.
One
But
of the other interesting things about this is you also get to see it's a little bit of insight into the paparazzi culture and a lot of like 90s tabloid culture in terms of the way that the movie was covered, the people across the street taking pictures that they're trying to challenge, which personally, if I were working on a film like this and I saw paparazzi across the street, I'd be like, go ahead, let them take their pictures because they're just going to build up hype for this movie. But there's one point in this movie, I don't know if it was Entertainment Tonight or one of those 90s like entertainment tabloid type of shows, and they refer to Tarantino as a blood and guts maestro, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. Is like blood and guts maestro, what, like Herschel Gordon Lewis or something like that? Up to this point in his career, the only two movies he directed were Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. And yeah, they're violent movies, but there's not exactly what I would refer to as blood and guts, like something like George Romero or Herschel Gordon Lewis. It's just funny how deeply mischaracterized Quentin Tarantino is in the media at this point in time.
Yeah, especially with that tabloid TV. I found it particularly interesting on this part to show how it translates from, you know, the documentarians went up to the paparazzi and were asking them questions, and they were pretty defensive, you know, like not closing the trunk and not letting them see their equipment and shit like that, and telling them why they have the right to be there. But I thought it was interesting to see the translation from those guys just hanging out trying to get a shot, and then they sell it to Entertainment Tonight or Extra or whatever, and then the translation, there's something sickening about it, you know, like misrepresenting Tarantino and kind of just, they don't really know what they're talking about. They're just trying to dish the tea, you know?
I don't know. I think it's a little bit too goofy to be sickened by it. It's just far too silly to even take offense to it. But that's also another product of its time, because I know that they still have stuff like Entertainment Tonight that goes on to this day, but there's a level of tabloid trashiness that has been taken out of it over the years that I think has become less appealing as society has changed. So that's another interesting insight into the movie. Pay attention to some of the tabloid television programs and the way that they discuss the film and the filmmakers. It's so bizarre and so strange.
Yeah. So it had all this fun stuff, and then it had the serious stuff, like all the trials and tribulations of building a set in the middle of the desert, and like accidentally setting the whole facade on fire, and how they adjusted their you know, workflow to make up for that. There's a lot of really cool behind the scenes stuff.
Unexpected things like a sandstorm appearing might delay or halt production in ways that you don't expect. Shows the kind of stuff to be prepared for if you're making for a movie. The unexpected things that happen on set, especially when you're working in an environment that's not on a sound studio, where it's out in like the middle of the desert, nature. That's not something that you really have much control over. So you learn a lot about the possible things that could go wrong or happen on a set to delay your shoot or make it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, and being out there for hours and hours in 122-degree heat, insanity, dude.
Mm-hmm. But mostly what I took away from this film, from the filmmaking process, at least when it comes to this movie, it seems like everybody who was working on this was having a blast. Half of the time they didn't even seem like they're working. A lot of when you interview a lot of the crew members, what I found interesting is when they're asking him, why do you take this job? What do you like about it? And they say things so I don't have to take a real job. To them, this is just like, I get to goof around all day and make movies and hang out with directors and filmmakers on set. Why would I not want to be doing this? Why would I want to go to a regular 9-to-5 job after? It's never going to cut it. It's never going to compare to the experiences that you have on set. So you get the sense that a lot of the people who are doing this do it because they think it's fun.
Yeah, and there's even a sense of fun with the problems that arise.
Mm-hmm.
And that challenge, that they consider it a personal challenge and a personal triumph when they get over it.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing was really cool. And I like the little mini Tarantino interview with Harvey Keitel. Like, it has the text comes up and said, well, Harvey Keitel was cast to be in From Dusk Till Dawn. He wasn't cast to be in Full Tilt Boogie, so he only agreed to be on camera for the last 10 minutes on set. So I had a little conversation with Tarantino and just I love to hear older actors like Harvey Keitel just pontificating about the process.
It was interesting. It was vaguely pretentious, just a little bit
Yeah.
there. I was not quite there, but it was starting to verge on Jared Leto vibes. Some of the things that he said were like, okay, you think so, but you think very highly of yourself in this process, but it's pretty funny.
And he's not afraid to be poetic.
Yeah, yeah.
But I love the going over the fire stunt. They showed that iconic fire stunt opening that always stuck out to me as being a particularly effective fire stunt. How the guy kind of jumps up on the counter,
Mm-hmm.
shooting the gun at them, and he falls down on the floor in flames.
Mm-hmm.
I loved how they showed that whole thing, and then they end the movie in a really cool way. They're just about to wrap production, and then after all that union talk back and forth, and it wasn't all positive on the production. You know, there were people complaining about some of the food and some of the hours and stuff, but it kind of ended in this. They gave everybody in the cast and crew health care,
Mm-hmm.
so it ended in something where you see all this trouble with the unions, and then it ends with the producers really making a true effort to do something, to do right by these people who work so hard for them.
Yeah. Well, overall, I think it's a fun documentary, and I think it's a fun documentary because for large portions of it, it plays just like a 90s character-driven film as opposed to a documentary. It gives you good insight into the filmmaking process, so the types of problems and the issues that arise on set, the types of things that you deal with, but also a peek into the inner lives of the people who work on it and the type of relationships that they develop on set and the romances that happen and the friendships that are formed and the fun that it's had and the memories that are built. So I think that's what makes Full Tilt Boogie a special behind the scenes documentary, because it's more concerned, a little more concerned with the people who made the movie than it is with the production of the movie, which is a big part of it. But it usually is the other way around. Whenever you see a film that's about the making of something, there's very little about the people involved. It's all about the work that they're doing and what they do to get from point A to point B. This goes into areas that you don't expect it to go into. And I think that makes it a little bit more engaging. And it also makes it feel like the people that you're watching are movie characters. You can relate to them a little bit better and you have a better understanding as opposed to them just watching them do a job.
Yeah, I think it's as entertaining as it is informative.
Yes, very informative, entertaining. And I would say with a likable cast of characters, even though these are not a cast, not a cast of characters, it's people.
Definitely, those assistants are especially entertaining. Both Tarantino's assistant and Clooney's assistant.
Especially George Clooney's assistant when she talks about the things that she does to get him ready.
Yeah, they pretty much have to run their lives. You said you put personal in front of the word assistant, and you would pretty much give up your life for them.
If you want to check it out, it's actually not that easy to get a hold of. It's not streaming anywhere, and it's not even really available to rent. The documentary comes with and you have this on Blu-ray. It's a quadruple feature from Miramax that has all three from Dusk Till Dawn movies plus Full Tilt Boogie, and it used to come with the DVD of From Dusk Till Dawn. The next documentary you won't really have to look too hard for.
Oh no, this one is in stark contrast to the last one. This is almost all, even, this is still entertaining in its own right, but it's so informative, deeply informative, I would say. It's a Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, a history of folk horror from 2021, just last year, and it's on Shudder. It was written and directed by producer Kiera Janice, and it's the executive producer David Gregory from Severin Films, and he directed Plague Town. And we interviewed him a few months ago, or it's been over a year now, huh?
Yeah, it was over a year ago.
David Gregory is a really cool filmmaker. I love Severin Films. I love all these documentaries that he puts together, and this one really keeps up the high level of quality that we're used to seeing from him. It's a thorough overview and dissection of the subgenre of folk horror, with contributions from many of the major creators and clips from cinema all over the world. There's over 100 films discussed in over 50 interviews. They speak with authors, filmmakers, historians, folklorists, magazine editors, and it has these traditional, really haunting folk songs in it, animation and paper collages mixed with movie scenes between interviews. Just a really fascinating documentary, like right from the get-go.
I mean, this documentary covering folk horror and a lot of its influences and what it's born out of, and is a much deeper dissection than I had initially expected it to be. I heard so many good things about this documentary, and I thought it was probably going to be a good rundown of what folk horror is. But this is so much more than that. This is a very academic breakdown of folk horror. It comes across more as an anthropological study of people and cultures, and how different cultures and different belief systems kind of clash, and how these clashing belief systems kind of give birth to a very specific type of horror rooted in rural ideas versus urban ideas, the past versus modernity. So I really love the approach that they had with this documentary. It's deeply informative, and it gives you a good sense of why folk horror exists and the conditions that it's born out of.
And it doesn't forget, in the entire 3 hours and something runtime, it never forgets to entertain you the whole time, even as in depth as it goes. It opens with a great little sample of a folk horror story setup, and then it goes into the explanation of what constitutes folk horror. And then we start taking these deep dives into the unholy trinity, is what they call it, which is the three movies that pretty much started the folk horror craze, which is Witchfinder General with Vincent Price, Blood on Satan's Claw, and of course Wicker Man, that we discussed a few episodes back on the podcast. They talk about all the parallels to Westerns, how they were nihilistic, a lot like the Westerns. And then it tells all the different things that, because it starts out as a very specific thing, mainly in England. And then when they start opening up into other areas of the world, you really see a lot more, it explores a lot more themes. Like it explores how older people are scared of youth. Basically with this, I feel like a new fan again. And I want to explore this strange new subgenre, but I'm also very familiar with it, because I'm sure you noticed through the years that we've been huge fans of various key folk horror movies throughout the years, and we just didn't know it was this certain subgenre. There was so much more to explore.
I mean, a lot of what's in here I didn't even initially conceive of as folk horror, something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Candyman. But I mean, what I find interesting about folk horror is that they all come in similar environments. The first big wave of folk horror, which they described in the 70s, which kind of came with that unholy trinity that you described, it comes in the wake of Vietnam, social and political unrest, and it always reflects the fears of an ever-changing society. It comes out of the hippie movement, the Back to the Land movement, the environmental activism of the 1970s, women's liberation, the feminist movement of the 1970s, and it always seems to come at a time where there's a big changing of culture, and there's always that type of fear that a lot of people have, that the world that we're moving into is not actually real progress at all. And I think a lot of rural communities feel that way. You kind of feel that tension between urban communities and rural communities. It's even kind of political. You feel that tension between the left and the right, trying to move on to a new place of progress versus staying where we're at. And I don't think it's a coincidence, and they explore this, that the other big wave of folk horror came out under similar political conditions that the original the initial wave of folk horror came out of: political unrest, a divisive American president, a very divisive referendum in Europe going on. It is literally identical circumstances that caused the second wave of folk horror with films like The Witch, Midsommar, a lot of what Ari Aster's and Robert Eggers delve into. And I noticed almost every area, like part of the world where folk horror is a thing, there's a history of like colonialism attached to it.
Yeah.
There's always a history of a culture that's been displaced by settlers or travelers. So it always has to deal with the fear of the old and the new, and the way that things kind of clash, and the clash between paganism and Christianity. So kind of fascinating, because it says so much about culture and about where we are as a society. And I think this is what's great about horror. And it's not just folk horror, but folk horror specifically for the purposes of this documentary. But horror, more than any other genre, more than comedy or action or anything else, really is a reflection of where society is at. I think horror in any era can tell you so much about society, because horror is all about reflecting our fears back to us. And this is what it reminds me is I love horror. It's fun. There's so much about it that is just surface level fun, the gore, the violence, the darkness. But I think it's so much more of an intellectual genre than people give it credit for. And then I think it speaks so much about where we're at as a society in a way that other genres just do not have that type of pull, that anthropological pull that you could delve in with something like this.
I wanted to touch on just a few of the movies that they talk about on here that really stuck out to me as ones that I've seen in the past. Like when they were exploring British folk horror, they started talking about the roots of it. And one of the roots of British folk horror was this movie called Night of the Demon. It's also called Curse of the Demon, so either Night of the Demon or Curse of the Demon. It's from 1957. It's about a doctor who heads to a paranormal psychology conference in London to expose a satanic cult leader. And he's skeptical of his power, so he stayed at his estate, where he's made a believer when he's haunted by a death curse. That was highly recommended one from 1957. There's some others that they explore that I hadn't seen any of them. Like they talked about all the ghost stories for Christmas. It's like a whole series of British folk horror films. I'd like to explore every one of those. But they even dip into Doctor Who and Rawhead Rex, which was it was in disguise of like a cheesy monster movie in the 80s, but it was really a kind of a deep folk horror.
I mean, the story that it's based on is the Clive Barker story is it's very much a piece of folk horror, but the adaptation of it's folk horror, but it's really cheesy. I think you need to get back to the original short story to see what makes it such a good folk horror film. Kind of made me laugh to see it placed there. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. But it shows how much, once the folk horror subgenre was established, it started branching off, and it started exploring different things. Like they explored people leaving cities and falling victim to country folk. It explored past and history threatening to reemerge, and how rich people fear the poor, and then about rich people kind of forcing the poor people into more rural areas and pushing them into the woods, and then being scared and frightened of what they're doing out there in the woods.
Being scared and frightened of it, but also kind of othering a lot of these people and blaming them for their own, for the poverty that they live in, and the unlivable conditions. They kind of blame it on them, and then kind of create this fear around them at the same time, the fear of the rural.
Yeah, it's all the different aspects of folk horror it's a lot of horror brought on by paranoia.
Mm-hmm.
And just like it explores pagan mythology, how it threatened Christianity. That was a big part of the forming of Halloween. Christianity liked to take certain pagan rituals and use them for their own purposes and kind of bastardize them, but they were scared of pagans at the same time. And that brings me to another one I wanted to highlight that I always loved from 1988, The Lair of the White Worm. Mostly I loved it as a kid just because that creature freaked me out, that dragon-like snake woman. Mm-hmm. It's about an archaeologist who uncovers a strange skull, and the residents of a nearby town begin to disappear. He later finds that an ancient cult worshipped a giant dragon snake that survived the civilization's destruction and has been accidentally resurrected. It's psychological just as much as it is a monster movie, so I highly recommend that one too. Mm-hmm. And it shows how another way that folk horror explores our ancestors and how, as we evolve as a society, we want to forget our dark past. So mm-hmm. It's constantly coming back to haunt us.
I mean, another thing that's kind of interesting about folk horror, since so much of it is about the past and our fear of the past, and how it actually kind of goes both ways. It's about how people in more urban settings kind of fear the old ways of the past, and people in more rural settings kind of fear the future and where it's going. There's usually two different types of folk horror films. There's the folk horror films that take place in the past and make the past seem scary. So even though those movies don't take place in the present time, they're still created in the context of our present state. So they still kind of manage to reflect the fears of what we think of old society, of what we think of old religions, of paganism, of witchcraft, of all these different things. And the other type of folk horror film is the ones that take place now, equally as informed by the present, of course, because they take place in the present. The ones that take place in the now are more about things coming out of the past to haunt us.
That's what it was talking about, the whole section, the third section about We Don't Go Back, where it explores all the pagans and witchcraft and folk horror. And then I thought it was really cool how they explored the reinventing of customs, how they take these old customs and then they make them into these movies that become such a part of the society, a part of that society, that it becomes the folklore. So the folklore that the movie creates kind of feeds into the real folklore, and it makes for fascinating stories.
I mean, that's what's kind of interesting about folk horror, is that it's very a word of mouth tradition, a way of kind of like passing down stories, whereas opposed to something like Christianity or modern Christianity has a very specific text, the Bible, where you could go back and you could refer to it and pull things out as an examples. A lot of the old traditions and customs of paganisms and a lot of things that inspire folk horror are not really things that we have records of or solid records. Some of what we do have is even questioned by academics, the authenticity, but we can only go off on word of mouth. And what's interesting is that a lot of these early folk horror films were very inaccurate because they were going with what they had at the time. And a lot of the text that they were referring to has since been kind of debunked by a lot of academics. But folk horror traditions are about passing stories down. So these films become kind of part of the folk horror, kind of become part of the mythology. So a lot of culture ends up adapting practices that come from the movies that were inaccurately adapting texts that were questionable in the first place. So it's this really interesting kind of passing down of traditions and storytelling, and how each generation kind of like remakes the myths to fit their own age, to fit whatever the purpose that they need, whatever purpose they need it to fit. Each storyteller modifies it to kind of speak to the modern era. But it's really fascinating. It's very fascinating stuff.
And if you notice, feminine energy kind of permeates through a lot of folk horror, because a lot of folk horror explores how humanity is afraid of feminine power, because in the Bible days, women were subservient. Women were second class citizens. They were there to serve men. So a lot of it comes from the rise of femininity.
I mean, that just goes to show you how much folk horror is about the tension between progress and kind of staying stuck in the past. And I think, like, things like the Salem witch trials is a thing that fuels folk horror. When you think of a film like which was one of the Witchfinder General, which they call one of the major ones, that one's actually based on a true story, where it's about somebody who went around accusing different women of witchcraft. And he was bullshitting. He was lying a lot of the times. He was just using it to persecute women. But a lot of even the witch trope comes out of this fear, this big fear of women having power in a society where men are used to ruling. So it's not a coincidence that a lot of the witchcraft movies became popular during the 70s, because the 70s is the time when the women's liberation was a big thing in the 1970s. So it only makes sense that the horror would kind of reflect that. But it's almost kind of cool that through the years, the witch trope has kind of been reclaimed, how it's kind of a cool thing now. When you see movies, as time goes on, you see movies like The Craft, where it's a representative of female power, where it's really cool to be a witchy kind of figure. So so much of this folk horror, so much of the storytelling traditions, and so much of these tropes are not just tropes. They reflect so many deep-rooted fears in society, and they say so much about culture and how it advances and how it goes back at the same time. I expected this to be a more elementary documentary than that. I didn't expect it to be an exploration of how culture influences folk horror and how it takes its cues from society at the time.
And one of the many things that fascinated me about this documentary is the American folk horror section of it. Because I knew that we had touched on folk horror throughout American cinema, but I didn't know how much and how how many things in our history were ripe for folk horror. And I shouldn't have been so surprised, but it is. Like, for instance, it explores how the beliefs of Puritans were completely shattered. I thought that was fascinating. I never thought of it like that.
Mhm.
So the Puritans came here and they thought that they were the chosen ones. They thought they were the chosen people who were meant to come here and discover this land. And they had all these preconceived notions. And then they get here and Native Americans are here and they've been here for many years. So all their beliefs were shattered. All their beliefs were bullshit. So now they looked at Native Americans as planted here by the devil.
That's actually an interesting thing to bring up because, like you said, it kind of shattered their preconceived notions of how the country how the country out here was going to be like, and that shows like we were discussing earlier how folk horror kind of thrives in areas where different cultures are displaced. And what you see when the settlers arrive is kind of this type of disrespect, and the type of storytelling that arises out of it really others indigenous people and native people. And it's almost, these stories are told from the point of view as they were slated to die off, that they were fated to fall by the wayside, when really it was settlers who were displacing the culture, who were taking over the land, who were taking away all the rights of these people, kind of dehumanizing them. But they used storytelling to tell themselves, no, we didn't dehumanize these people. It was destiny. It was slated for this to happen. Their old ways were meant to die off, while at the same time adopting things about their culture. So it kind of like value some of the way that they interact with nature. They value some of the wisdom of indigenous people, some of the knowledge that they have, the way that they've mastered the land. They want to take all those things that are so cool about the culture, but fuck the people, we'll just displace them. And then we created this folk horror tradition where these people were always slated to die off in the first place.
Yeah, and just like how they explored what we did with American Westerns. Like, we're just realizing in recent years how much we bastardized our past with these old Westerns. Because Westerns basically reduced an entire culture of thousands of tribes of Native Americans to just Indians, the evil Indians who wanted to kill us. And this again, like just like with the others, we wanted some of their customs, but not them. We just wanted them out of our hair.
The trope of the Indian burial ground is something that I found really interesting because, like you said, we've kind of taken a very complex group of indigenous people. There's so many different tribes and so many different belief systems, and turned it all into one thing. And a lot of folk horror kind of like really delves into that trope of building on top of Indian burial ground, of building on top of Native American burial ground, and kind of that being the source of the haunting. But one of the interesting points that they make in this documentary is what makes that fear so ridiculous is that it's a little bit false. And technically, on a certain level, all of America is built on an Indian burial ground. So if you feel that sense of guilt, it doesn't matter where you're at. It doesn't matter where you're at. The whole thing is Indian burial ground. So it's really fascinating how folk horror kind of became a reflection of people's fears, the reflection of the fears of other people, the fear of people that we don't understand.
That kind of evolves into discussion of 70s films about utopian societies and all the satanic panic of the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of utopian societies popping up. That's why it was reflected in the movies, and they were actually cults. And so instead of, in British folk horror, they had pagans in Europe. So they traded pagans in Europe for weird Christians in the US. I thought that was a cool thing to explore too.
I mean, that's also pretty cool because it shows how similar folk horror is, but how it adapts to the specific cultures. Because even as different as American and British folk horror is, they still kind of swim in the same tropes. I think the biggest difference between the UK and the United States is that the Christianity is such a like Western, especially like Western beliefs, any kind of Christianity, Abrahamic belief systems are what rules in the United States. But the UK, the only religion that they ever contributed to the world was witchcraft. So you can see the same tropes being adapted to different belief systems.
Yeah, just like movies like Children of the Corn that were about fear of isolated communities, and how Isaac kind of changed things in the Bible, and they talked about how that was parallel with kind of what the Mormons did.
Mm-hmm.
The Mormons came along and said, our leader took a look at the Bible and says, I want to change this, this, and this, and we're all going to follow it after that.
Because he said he had a vision of some special place where God gave him the new wisdom. And a lot of it, and not to be offensive, but a lot of these belief systems are very cult-like, whether it's Christianity or whether it's paganism. So you could transfer a lot of the same tropes to either religion, and it works out. But what makes it cool is that as similar as the tropes are, if you put it in Australia, you put it in the United States, you put it in Britain, each trope will say something about the culture of the country that it comes from, and that's what I love about it. And how a lot of the myths of folk horror are things that exist all over the world. Obviously, La Llorona is something that they cover in this Mexican piece of folklore, but I never really thought about it, how banshees are the same thing, how that story actually exists in almost every culture, but each culture puts their own spin on it and kind of like makes it relevant to the issues facing that specific country. But they're basically all the same story, changed a little bit just to speak to whatever issues that this country is facing, to speak to whatever religion is dominant in this country, in that country. I mean, Australia has a history of colonialism in the same way that the United States has the history of colonialism, and Britain has a history of colonialism. And each of the folk horror that comes out of each of these countries is very reflective of the people displaced by each of the indigenous people replaced by each of these societies.
And then they also discuss the multiple facets of folk horror within each country, within each society. There's multiple things to explore. Like with American folk horror, you get into American prairie horror, which is a whole different type of thing, because you still get the claustrophobia that you feel, but it's in open spaces. So you're in an open space with rolling hills, but you still feel claustrophobic because of the themes that it uses. Like it discusses the wind, how the wind used to scare women to death in the prairie. Just the wind kind of whipping through the houses and the trees and shit.
It's so loud that they described it as it drove women crazy because you couldn't even hear your own thoughts. You couldn't even communicate with other people properly. And I've always had like a weird thing against superstitions, but superstitions make sense in the context of that they were born in, what they come out of. So one of the things that they discuss in this documentary is how a lot of folk horror in the past, it comes from societies that were not connected the same way that we are now. We live in a world where if there's a big war going on, we all know it instantly. Everybody knows everything all the time. We didn't come from a world where we're isolated from people. A lot of these folk horror stories, like something like The Witch, it's about people who live in isolation. They don't know what's going on with the world outside. Any big news that's happening is probably going to take a really long time to reach them. So a war could be going on for a very long time before people in certain areas are even aware of what's going on. So when all you have is nothing but the landscape and your imagination to feed off of, it only makes sense that you start telling these stories. You start attributing these things to your belief systems because you don't really have anything else to base it off of. And I think that's really fascinating, and I think that's what makes folk horror such a rural thing.
Yeah, and that brings me to another one that I really wanted to highly recommend that they touched on in this. It's a more modern take on folk horror. It's called Jugface from 2013. Ever since I saw this when it first came out on video, I've been begging people to watch this. It puts some people off because of the depth of it and the weirdness of it, but I think it's really a must-see. It's a fascinating little film. So it's about when she learns the supernatural pit worshipped by her remote community in the woods has demanded her as a blood sacrifice, Ada struggles to find a way to survive while the pit lashes out in anger. It's really weird. It's really atmospheric. It's really kind of off-putting in a way. It's quirky in a way, but it's definitely all folk horror. And it's movies like this that make me want to go explore all these different facets of folk horror that they talk about. They even talk about episodes of The Waltons, which I used to watch in the 70s, has a folk horror episode. The Twilight Zone has some folk horror in it.
Mm-hmm. Lovecraft is based a lot on folk horror, which is not something that I ever gave consideration to. And even something like Candyman, which I always considered that more of an urban myth than I would say folk horror because it comes out of more modern urban settings. But it really is it really is a lot like folk horror. It's very geographical. It's very based on the land that it's built upon. and it's very much a myth that gets recreated over and over again. So there's a lot of interesting things in here that I would never have considered folk horror. Something like Deliverance is not something I would have considered folk horror, but it makes sense. That's just not supernatural folk horror. In the same way,
Yeah.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre could be folk horror. It's not supernatural folk horror, but it is folk horror in the sense that it reflects the fears that a lot of people have of rural communities, of people being stuck in the past. The kind of the way that the popular imagination kind of makes people that we don't understand seem a lot stranger and more out there than they really are. Whether it's Native Americans that are displaced on their lands, or it's the rural South being left behind by the rest of the country, we tend to like villainize anybody that isn't kind of in step with the modern world as being backwards or scary or from the backwoods. And that's something that I never thought, but that's something that unites both the rural South and displaced Native American tribes. And before this documentary, I would have never have made a connection between those two very different cultures. But there is some kind of connection there, and I think a lot of the horror that's based around both of these cultures comes out of the same fears.
That's why I love this whole section, how it explains how Candyman is a folk horror, even though folk horror isn't normally set in the city. But it goes to the whole section of this exploring Southern Gothic and the Reconstruction anxiety in the South after slavery, and the rise of the fear of voodoo and hoodoo. And that's when it explores the what we just watched recently for when we discussed black horror. It goes into Eve's Bayou, which is a really good movie. The Beloved with Oprah Winfrey and Danny Glover was really awesome. Angel Heart with Robert De Niro and Lisa Bonet. A Serpent in the Rainbow, an awesome, underrated Wes Craven film with Bill Pullman. And they also talk about Ganja and Hess, which shows how Christianity has been used as warfare.
I mean, that was an interesting one, because Ganja and Hess is, I just consider that more of like a straight vampire art house movie, but it makes sense that it's also about folk horror, because I there's a lot of symbolism that I picked up on that movie, but I think I actually have a better understanding of that. And I love Ganja and Hess. I think that's a masterpiece, but I think I have a better understanding of it after watching this, how it's also about the displacement of culture. How in the 1970s, especially with all the social unrest and everything going, there was kind of that movement, just like there was a Back to the Land movement, just like there was kind of that environmental activism. There is a black movement to try to get more in touch with your roots, and how it was kind of at odds with trying to conform and assimilate into society. And something I never considered, the symbolism I never really considered about Ganja and Hess, is about the fact that the vampire dies in the shadow of the cross, which serves as a metaphor for how Christianity has displaced so many a lot of African religions, and kind of like crushed out a lot of the past that a lot of black people share and try to replace it with something different, and how it's kind of been used and weaponized to kill people. So there's a lot of interesting things like that. And it kind of reminds you that horror is a much more intellectual, probing genre than a lot of people give it credit for. When people describe it as like, just cheap thrills or something like that, I'm like, no, I don't know if there's any other genre out there that explores our fears and our anxieties, that explores the human condition, that explores so many of these really complex ideas the way that horror does. I can't think of any other genre that does this.
Well, look how massive and nuanced just this particular subgenre is.
Folk horror?
And and it's one I wasn't even aware of for the most part. Like, I'd been watching folk horror and enjoying it all these years, and wasn't even realizing that they were all speaking to very similar themes.
Very true. I mean, a lot of what I considered folk horror was just more of the typical, like, British folk horror, something like The Wicker Man, obviously, or an American one, Midsummer. That's obviously a folk horror film, but I never thought of folk horror in the context of different cultures. I always thought of it as a very, I wouldn't say British thing, but something that's more based on the tension between Christianity and paganism, not the tension between colonialism and Native Americans, not the tension between the rural South and Reconstruction anxieties, not the tension between Australian society and the colonialism that they engaged in. And I thought it was I thought it was something very specific and something very fascinating. but it's much more cultural and it's much more universal than we originally thought. And I love how folk horror just adapts to whatever region it ends, whatever region it's in. Kind of retains the same basic ideas, but it adapts it for the specific issues that face each culture.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and another thing I found interesting about this documentary, about the whole dynamic of it, was about, have you noticed later in the documentary when it gets into that third hour, it starts really picking up and mentioning more movies. It starts going faster because in the beginning they set up the beginning of folk horror. They explored British folk horror, the whole beginnings of it there. They explored American folk horror. They explored all the, the Southern Gothic and stuff like that. But then when they start exploring like other countries, like they get into Australian folk horror, to Mexican folk horror, to Thailand, and it really starts
folk horror.
It almost starts spreading itself thin. But if you really think about it, they set the foundation of what they're talking about that kind of permeates through all these countries.
I mean,
but it's still interesting to note the differences in each country in their interpretation of folk horror.
See that part, and this is a long documentary, and it needs to be long to have this type of to have the level of exploration that this documentary has. It needs to be over 3 hours, like it is. And what initially seems like it was rushed, after a little bit, you realize that it's not rushed because, like you said, the foundations are there. And by the time we get to the folk horror around the world, you already understand the foundations and the fears, and you don't have to get into it as in depth. Because I wouldn't say the cliches, that's not really the right word, but the groundwork has already been laid for the circumstances that folk horror is born out of. And all you have to do is explain, well, in Latin America, it's a little bit different here because of the specific fears that happen in this society. In Australia, it's a little bit different, but the groundwork is already there. It's basically the same story, just modified a little bit to fit whatever each culture, what each culture is like.
Yeah, that reminds me, I was going to mention Australian folk horror. Like the particularly interesting thing about that, they explore movies like Lake Mungo, Picnic at Hanging Rock, Wolf Creek, where they talk about they had a bicentennial type of celebration in Australia in 1988 to celebrate their white settlement, and so many people celebrating it, and then certain artists were saying, there's something inherently wrong with us celebrating this. So their folk horror is a critique of that type of celebration. So they really had a boom after 1988 of folk horror in Australia. That's one of the things that shows that they all follow the same basic premises, the same basic themes, but they explore it in their own unique way based on their own history. And just like the white settlement celebration in 1988 is much like our celebration of our Civil War leaders and shit like that.
Yeah, it's different, but it's ultimately all the same. And I think it says a lot about culture that as different as all these different cultures are, we all face very similar issues that seem to be kind of universal.
Yeah. And I wanted to do one more quick recommendation. Another one that they touched on. I'm sure when you saw this, you knew that this was one I would love to discuss. Juniper Tree, with my favorite singer Bjork, when she was like in her early 20s. She was like barely 25. It's from 1990. It's an Icelandic folktale about two sisters who flee their homeland after their mother is killed for witchcraft, and the older sister casts a spell over a young farmer to fall in love with her. It's very dark fairy tale, very moody, very, very folk horror. If you get a chance to check that one out. I have it on VHS.
Okay, I've actually never seen that before, so I'll have to check it out sometime. I actually looked it up. There are lists that you can find out online where it lists every movie discussed in here, and I would like to do that sometime, to have the time to actually really explore folk horror to a greater extent. As it is, I'm more familiar with folk horror than I thought, because so much of what I considered something different is actually folk horror. So it kind of taught me that folk horror is wider than what I thought it was. It was what I thought it was. Most of what I thought of as folk horror is the original folk horror, the foundations of folk horror. I never took in different countries as great examples of what folk horror is.
Yeah, and some of these have been some of my favorite little indie movies for years, like the Juniper Tree, and they started talking about the folk horror revival, and they started talking about this movie that I've been begging people to see since 2009. It's Wakewood. Highly recommend this one. It's a British horror film about the first theatrical release from Hammer Films in 30 years at the time. So it's about when a nine-year-old girl is killed by a savage dog. Her parents move to Wakewood, where they discover an ancient pagan ritual that allows them to spend 3 days with their dead daughter. That's another one, very dark, very emotional, has a lot of emotional depth to it. Very low budget, but very effective and hard hitting. That one is.
I know it's probably different, but that already sounds similar to something like Pet Cemetery. It comes out of the same type of fears of resurrecting people and wanting to see your dead child again one more time.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I didn't realize how much Stephen King's horror is actually based in folk horror, folk traditions.
Oh, yeah.
I never thought of Pet Cemetery or Children of the Corn as folk horror films. And I feel dumb for not even thinking of something like Children of the Corn as folk horror.
Yeah.
Because it has all of all of the tropes, especially the visuals and the iconography, the cornfields, the kind of going back to the old way of life, kind of like getting rid of all of the modern pleasures that we have, getting rid of technology, and just like worshiping the crop itself. I feel stupid that it was like, duh, of course Children of the Corn is folk horror. Of course Pet Cemetery is folk horror. It's stuff like this that made me realize I have a lot to learn. Basically what I'm trying to do is I have a lot to learn.
So in Children of the Corn, since they clearly do end up having power, does that mean that Isaac was right in the changes that he made to the Bible?
I don't know.
Could be.
Could be.
But this really explores really well how folk horror around the world is kind of interconnected in very complex ways, because each culture deals with the evolution of society differently. Mm-hmm. Whether it be, any kind of social norms, whether it be the rise of femininity, or the rise of going against old ways that kind of seem archaic now.
Yeah.
So that's always going on. So it picks something really cool to explore right at the last closing minutes of the documentary, where it says, we live in dark times, and we really do. There's a lot of uncertainty, and it's right for folk horror right now. That's why we need to get to making some more folk horror movies, because we're doing it to ourselves. And we have the same pessimism about the future as we did in the 70s, and we have damn good reason for it. And we have the digital era, which makes some of us yearn for the old ways. So it's all perfect environment for folk horror. I like how it explored that right at the end.
I mean, what's interesting is that how folk horror adapts is because isolation is different depending on what era you come from. So isolation might be different in something like The Witch, where you're just cut off from society and you have nothing but superstitions for your mind to feed off, superstitions and your imagination. Society now can be alienating in completely different ways. We have too much. There's too much information. There's too much taken. So a lot of people become paranoid, start becoming conspiracy theorists. They don't know what's real anymore. So isolation can come out of a lot of different contexts. And I think each era is ripe for exploration in folk horror, and how isolation is a big part of it.
Yeah, and the thing that I found, that there's a lot of fascinating things about this documentary, but the thing I found the single most fascinating thing is how it's not often that a documentary like this ends with this profound discussion of the future of this subgenre. You usually explore a subgenre like this and you talk about the heyday of that subgenre. You talk about the inception of it, and then how it became popular and how it kind of died out. But with this one, it discusses the real possibilities of this becoming an even richer subgenre because of the times we live in. I thought that was really cool to end with.
It's also really cool because since folk horror is about the tension between the old and the new, the past and the present, as long as society keeps advancing and going into different places, and it usually does, as long as there's a march forward of progress, there's always going to be a folk horror movement to reflect whatever the progress is at the time. So it's not it's born out of certain conditions, and as long as that keeps going, it's going to be there. As opposed to other subgenres that might have their heyday here and there, but kind of fizzle out. This one seems like something that could kind of be almost timeless and eternal.
And it's something you can explore as a whole. It's something you can take a country at a time. It's something you can take a theme at a time. It's such a rich subgenre. I get so excited when I see something like this, and I see a whole different section of horror open up to me.
Yeah, I mean, really check this documentary out because it's beautiful and it's expansive and it's informative and it's entertaining. It's thought provoking. I struggle to even put into words a lot of what I'm trying to describe, the ideas that are in this documentary. It's such a rich subject. You have to see the documentary yourself.
Definitely. And I wanted to close off talking about it because this really inspired me to go back and look at a lot of things that I've watched, and realizing that a lot of my favorite films are folk horror. So I just had a couple quick recommendations of ones that they did not mention in the documentary, especially Plague Town from 2008. I was especially impressed that they didn't mention this one because the executive producer is David Gregory, and he directed Plague Town. So it's kind of cool that he resisted mentioning it in the documentary, because it is really a small movie that nobody watched. But I highly recommend it.
But then they could have, because a lot of the movies in this documentary are small movies that nobody has watched.
Oh, that's true. So if you want to explore some more folk horror, check out Plague Town from 2008, about an American family visiting their Irish roots and become victim to mutant children in the Irish countryside, and a community trying to breed with outsiders to purify their bloodline. Also, Yellow Brick Road. It's all one word, Yellow Brick Road from 2010. It's about after the entire population of Friar, New Hampshire disappears into the mountains in 1940, a 2008 expedition attempts to solve the mystery and falls victim to the same fate. That one is really fascinating little movie. A lot of people rated it low because they couldn't really understand it, because it's really a cool exploration of folk horror in a really strange, off-putting way at times, but I thought it was really cool. And the other one is The Empty Man. They didn't mention The Empty Man, but that's a really good folk horror that everyone should check out. We discussed it a few episodes ago.
I'm going to add one more to that, and it's actually a film that I put on my top 10 horror movies of 21, the Welsh film The Feast. That's another one that is very much a folk horror film, and it is very much about the displacement of land, about about how urbanization and modernity kind of destroys nature and disrespects it in so many different ways. That one just came out last year, so it makes sense that they wouldn't have time to like incorporate everything. But that's a folk horror film that I would highly, highly recommend.
Cool. So this is even a richer subgenre than they can even cover in this 3.5 hour documentary.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, it's available on Shudder. It's available on AMC Plus. And if you don't have either of those, it's only $1.99 to rent. It's a pretty cheap deal for a 3-hour thing. It's only a couple bucks. It's totally worth the $2 that you would spend to watch this.
Yeah, and it's not just going through movies, the whole thing. It has a little stylistic flourishes in between with all the animation and the music and everything. Mm-hmm. And the way they incorporate clips from different movies. And I seen one reviewer say this. I recommend that too. If you watch this documentary, have a notepad with you and a pen, because you're going to want to write a lot of these down.
Yeah, definitely. So what do we do now, Michael? I can edit around this.
So what do you think? Should we touch on Morbius real quick before we end? How long have we been?
We've gone for about an hour and a half.
What do you think?
Let's keep it under 5 minutes, just because I don't want to be too negative, but let's just talk. We can talk about it.
Okay.
So yeah, check out both of these documentaries. I love them both for different reasons. Full Tilt Boogie, like I said, you're going to have to hunt down. This one you won't have to hunt down. And as much as I like the two, if you had to choose one, I would say go with the folk horror one, because it is so damn rich and it's so educating.
Yeah, the Full Tilt Boogie is just a blast. I mean, it is informative about the independent filmmaking process, but it's mostly just rock stars making a movie.
Yeah, basically. Before we touch off, since we try to keep current with the horror scene, we're gonna discuss this really quick because it's not worth a long discussion. Mike and I went to go see the latest superhero horror film. That's what they're gonna call it. Morbius with Jared Leto. Yeah, we went to go see that with their friend Julian, a friend to the podcast, Julian Bastida, and my lord, was that not a movie that is almost going to become legendary in how awful it is?
Yeah, I was willing to accept generic. I was willing to accept just anything that's just a coherent movie, just a decent action movie. I didn't even get that, dude. It's just awful. It's like a serviceable but cliched kind of origin story for half of it. And after that first half, it just starts plummeting into the depths of stupidity and bad editing and bad jokes and a bad villain.
Yeah, I'll say this. I had a fun time watching this movie, not for the reasons that I should have been having fun, but the audience we saw it with was very receptive to it in a very unusual way. There was a lot of giggling, and there's one moment in the movie where one of the characters, and this is such a disorganized conversation, but who cares? There's one moment in the movie where the love interest dies, and right before she dies, she does this thing where she licks her lips to indicate that she's going to become a vampire before she dies, but it's so corny, it's so cheesy. And I noticed, Michael, you were the first one to giggle at that scene. It was silence, and then I heard you giggle, and as soon as you started giggling, the audience gave in and was like, okay, this is pretty stupid, and everybody started laughing. There are several people in the audience who said, what the fuck is going on? What is this movie? What's going on right now? There was a lot of laughter at the villain. The villain in this movie makes no sense at all. He doesn't have a motive or a purpose or a reason. What was his goal?
He was just mad at Morbius. He was mad at Morbius because he wouldn't give him the serum. So he wants to kill him all of a sudden. He's willing to jeopardize his own power just to kill Morbius just because he wouldn't give him the serum.
But that doesn't make sense because he got the serum anyway and he became a vampire anyway. And he becomes a villain, but he doesn't have any motivation. There's no reason why he's a villain. There's no indication in the movie before that he has it in him to be a bad person or to be a villain. He does these ridiculous dances in front of the mirror while he's getting dressed, and then he starts scowling in his vampire face, which is goofy and ridiculous. Oh my lord, dude, this is so misguided on so many levels. I can't even begin to fathom what the hell was going on behind the scenes. And from what I understand, a lot of this is in the editing. I can't accept that a screenwriter would have put this out to the world. I don't blame the screenwriters. This has to have been the studio. This has to have been studio interference. The CGI is bad. The humor is dumb. The villain is nonsensical. There's no chemistry between the love interest. The one scene that they have, and dude, everybody in the audience started laughing. Morbius and his love interest, I can't even remember her name. They have one moment where they make out, and it's interrupted by the villain looking from afar and scowling at them making out, and like literally the whole audience was busting up in laughter at that point. Such silliness. It's nonsense. It's a bad movie. Lord, oh my god, dude. Poor Jared Leto. I don't know how he keeps ending up in all these turkeys.
Yeah, and then that kind of, it was already a lame joke from the trailer where someone asked Morbius, who are you? I'm Venom. And then he says, oh, just kidding, Dr. Morbius at your service. And it was already kind of a silly joke, but then in the movie they edit out the punchline and he just tells the person that he's Venom. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
And here's another thing. What is it with these like super villain movies that feel like superhero movies? It happened with the first Suicide Squad. I think James Gunn kind of fixed it with his Suicide Squad movie. But this reminds me of the Suicide Squad. You get a movie that's supposed to be about a villain, which in theory, this would separate it from a superhero movie because it's about the bad guys. But then the bad guys just end up going on a mission that any other superhero would be in. So how is Morbius a villain in this movie? And at the end of it, Michael Keaton's Vulture shows up, which actually doesn't make sense because this is supposed to be, I guess, a different part of the multiverse. It's not the same universe that Tom Holland exists in.
Yeah,
But Michael Keaton's Vulture is here anyway.
yeah.
And he teams up with him to take down Spider-Man. And by the end of the movie, Morbius never really turned into a villain. He's never met Spider-Man. He doesn't have a reason to take him down. What is the point of this villain team up? It doesn't even make sense for it to be there. It doesn't make sense for there to be a villain team up, and the villain doesn't even make sense in this movie why he's a villain or what his purpose is, because he actually doesn't really have a purpose. He's just bad. Because and it's so sloppy. It's just like it's getting to the point where it's like, does Sony feel like they could just shove whatever shit out shove anything out there because people are going to go up to see it, are going to show up to see it anyway? Because there is literally no thought into how some of this works out, and it doesn't make any sense. I don't know why the end Morbius would team up with Michael Keaton's Vulture to take down Spider-Man, because he's never met Spider-Man, and he never became a villain in this movie. He was kind of the hero. So why is he teaming up with the bad guy now?
Yeah, even the first half, which isn't that bad, is a painfully generic origin story where the young doctor is experimenting and he accidentally infects himself with whatever it is, and then the villain comes along and he wants to infect himself with the same thing, and they end up fighting, and the villain's always immediately more powerful than the other guy who's had it longer.
Yeah, there's no reason for that either. That doesn't really even make sense at all. And then he kills his love interest for, I don't even understand what reason. Like, really, I'm still trying to figure out what the purpose of the villain is. Even the worst superhero movie villains have a plan. They have an agenda. They have a reason. They have a purpose. This is just like, I took the serum and now I'm a bad guy because.
Yeah, and what's really embarrassing is they're all good actors. Even the villain is a good actor. He just given such a shitty character to become,
Yeah.
And those Snapchat filter looking faces sometimes, every now and then Morbius would look cool. But almost every shot of the villain looked like a cartoon, just like a Snapchat filter that turns your face into a demon.
And some of the slow motion action scenes are like dime store Zack Snyder imitations.
Yeah,
You can see that that's what they're going for, that like slow motion action, but it doesn't work. Zack Snyder finds a way to make it work. Even when his movies don't always work for me, his action scenes are very fluid and very well choreographed and exciting. This seems like it's trying to imitate that with like none of the skill required to actually pull it off.
Yeah, and they keep finding excuses to go higher and higher during the movie just so they could have another scene of slow motion falling.
Yeah, so it's one of those movies that's bad in a way that's hard to put into words, because usually when something is bad, you can make sense of why it doesn't work and why it's bad. This movie is so nonsensical and is full of so many nonsensical decisions that even discussing why it's bad is a challenge, because this movie doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and when you talked about me giggling during that one part, I'm not the kind of person who does that. I don't giggle during serious parts in movies because I think it kind of disrupts other people's experience. But that kind of just involuntarily came out, and I guess everybody else was waiting to laugh too.
You got the sense that the audience was aware that what they're watching was stupid and they didn't want to admit it. And all it took is for one either. And I noticed that it happened. I don't know if we infected the theater, the three of us, me, you, and Julian, because Julian started laughing his ass off at one scene that nobody was laughing at, and then everybody starts laughing at. There's a scene that nobody wanted to laugh at, the death scene that was supposed to be like deathly serious, and then you started giggling, and then after people like, okay, we can all giggle, we can all laugh at this, and then pretty soon it was spread throughout the entire audience, where like it would be silent, somebody in the audience would giggle at something, and then the rest of the audience felt like, okay, we could laugh at this. By the end, the audience was talking out loud back to the screen and saying things that normally this would ruin the movie and it would piss me off. but it actually enhanced my experience was having such an interactive audience, because by the end, people throughout the audience were shouting out comments here and there. This doesn't make sense. What the hell is that? And so many Batman imitations.
Oh yeah.
There's so many recalls to Batman Begins. And if I didn't know better, I would say they're even ripping off the Batman with Robert Pattinson, but they came out too close for that to be the case. But it's so many cheap Batman imitations, and it doesn't work. It's very obvious. So they even have that Batman Begins moment where Morbius is standing amidst bats that are flying around him. And there's even this Christopher Nolan-esque musical swell that comes right at that moment. It's just like, what are you doing? What is the purpose of this? Why? All you're doing is reminding us of better films that we'd rather be watching.
One guy in the audience just yelled out, "What's happening in this movie right now?" And everybody just laughs.
But yeah, terrible, just bad movie. But I had perversely strangely good time with it, just because the audience and the people around made it a fun experience. And because the audience kind of gave themselves license to laugh at it without feeling like anybody's interrupting the experience, the whole audience kind of became in on the derisive nature, kind of became in on the joke, and I think that made it a better experience.
Well, I think a lot of them were reacting the same way we were at first, where we kept looking at each other with our mouths open like, did they just say that? Did that just happen? We were like that for and almost in an irritated way. And then the irritation kind of gave way to laughter, and then after that, everyone in the theater was laughing.
Yeah. So that was our experience with Morbius.
Yeah, we don't need to go any deeper than that. It's not deeper than that.
There's nothing to delve into, but yeah, that was that. We figured we might as well throw that in just to keep up with what's going on. But yeah, Morbius.
Yeah, since it's another one that was supposed to be a horror movie, and we didn't end up getting it. We didn't even end up getting a decent movie, much less a horror.
Yeah, I don't know what you would call that. It's certainly a movie. I'll give it that. It's a movie. So anyways, keep up with us. Pretty soon, right now we're working on getting our crowdfunding campaign together. We're going to be working on Michael Pickle's upcoming film, The Dead Place. We have a lot of the pieces in play right now. We're going to be starting a crowdfunding campaign in a couple months. We're going to be doing some casting pretty soon. We've got a lot of people locked into it. Go on.
And in the next week or two, I'm just going to say we're going to launch a major campaign to get some more team members. So if anybody is interested in being a part of this feature film, working on it with us in any capacity you want, we're willing to teach you. That's what I love to do with every movie I make. Even though I'm a beginner in many ways, as I go up to each level, I like to take people that were down where I used to be and kind of help them and teach them and bring them along. It makes it a little harder on us sometimes, but the collaborative process, it makes it better.
Yeah. So keep up with that. And the best way to keep up with what we're doing with The Dead Place and the progress on that is through our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Pickles Horror Show. So if you go there, you're going to see constant updates for The Dead Place, the progress that we're making on it. But that's not all you're going to see. You're going to get all of the updates on whatever we're doing on the podcast currently, as well as horror news that may be going on, funny horror memes or jokes. Anything related to the world of horror is going to be reported on the Facebook page. Ditto the Instagram page, which is what's the Instagram page, Michael?
The Horror Show Pictures.
At the Horror Show Pictures. And then you can also follow us on TikTok. Michael runs the Facebook page. I run the TikTok page. And one of our other partners, Darian, runs the Instagram page. The content on each page is a little bit different. We're never doing the exact same thing, but all of these different platforms are a way to keep up with what we're doing and what we're up to at the current moment. I almost forgot. TikTok is at Horror Show Official.
Cool. So we got lots of cool stuff coming up. So keep checking back and interact with us. Let us know any topics you want to see on the show, any movies you want us to discuss. Any people you want us to interview, just let us know and we'll make an effort to do it.
Perfect. Till next week, folks. Happy
horror.